The sun was shining brightly over the bustling city streets as 12-year-old Chloe wandered through downtown, her eyes wide with curiosity. It was a Saturday afternoon, and she had been given permission by her mom to explore the city on her own for a few hours. The freedom felt exhilarating as she walked past stores with colorful displays, listening to the hum of conversations and laughter all around her. Chloe's braided hair bounced with every step she took, her favorite sneakers scuffing slightly against the pavement. She wore a simple, bright yellow dress that her mom had picked out for her that morning, saying it matched her sunny personality. Chloe smiled to herself at the thought, feeling a little grown-up being out on her own. As she turned a corner, she came upon a section of the street lined with high-end boutiques and designer stores. The shiny glass windows sparkled in the sunlight, showcasing elegant dresses, luxurious handbags, and gleaming jewelry. Chloe had never seen anything like it before. She stopped in front of one of the shops, mesmerized by a stunning dress displayed on a mannequin. It was long, flowing, and made of what looked like the softest fabric she'd ever seen, glimmering with tiny crystals. "Wow!" Chloe whispered to herself. "I wonder what it would feel like to wear something like that." Without thinking twice, she reached for the door handle, eager to take a closer look at all the beautiful things inside. But just as her hand touched the cool metal, a large figure appeared in front of her, blocking her path. Chloe looked up to see a tall, broad-shouldered security guard in a dark uniform. His name tag read Mike, and his expression was anything but friendly. "Where do you think you're going, kid?" he grunted, folding his arms over his chest. "I just wanted to look inside," Chloe stammered, taken aback by his harsh tone. "The dress, it's so pretty," Mike snorted, giving her a once-over with a look that made Chloe's skin crawl. "This isn't the place for you, kid. Run along now," he said dismissively, waving her away as if she were an annoying fly. Chloe's face burned with embarrassment. She glanced through the glass doors and saw two saleswomen watching the scene unfold with thinly veiled smirks. One of them, a tall woman with perfectly styled blonde hair named Karen, nudged her colleague Tiffany and whispered something that made them both laugh quietly. Determined not to let them see her cry, Chloe straightened her back and tried again. "I'm not going to buy anything," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I just wanted to look. Didn't you hear me the first time?" Mike growled, stepping closer to her. "Get out of here before I call the cops. We don't need any troublemakers around here." Chloe's heart sank as she turned away from the door, her cheeks still burning. She could feel the eyes of passers-by on her, some looking curious, others just ignoring her entirely. It felt like everyone was silently agreeing that she didn't belong there. Walking away, Chloe tried to push down the knot of anger and shame tightening in her chest. She found a bench a little further down the street and sat down, staring at the ground as tears welled up in her eyes. She had just wanted to see the beautiful things in the store, just like anyone else. Why was she treated differently? She looked down at her hands, which were trembling slightly. Her mom had always told her to hold her head high, no matter what. But right now, it was hard to remember that advice. Chloe took a deep breath and wiped her eyes, trying to regain her composure. She couldn't let a few mean people ruin her day. But still, the sting of their words lingered. Why did they treat me like that? Chloe wondered aloud, her voice barely a whisper. She didn't have an answer, and that made it hurt even more. As she sat there, trying to gather herself, she noticed people coming and going from the boutique freely, None of them stopped or questioned. They were all well-dressed, mostly white, and looked like they belonged. Chloe, on the other hand, was just a young black girl in a yellow dress, trying to find her place in a world that seemed determined to push her out. Minutes turned into what felt like hours as Chloe sat there, watching the world pass her by. She thought about going home, but the idea of walking through the door with red eyes and telling her mom what had happened was almost too much to bear. No, she thought, shaking her head slightly. I won't let them get to me. But as she gathered her courage to stand up, Chloe couldn't help but glance back at the store. The dress was still there, sparkling under the lights, almost like it was taunting her. She clenched her fists, feeling a fresh wave of anger. She had just wanted to look. Was that so wrong? Little did she know, her day was about to take a turn she could never have imagined. Chloe sat on the bench, wiping away the last traces of tears as she tried to steady her breathing. She kept looking back at the store, half expecting the security guard to come out and yell at her again. But Mike stayed inside, hovering near the entrance like a guard dog, making sure no one out of place would get in. Just when Chloe thought it couldn't get worse, the door to Madison's boutique opened, and the two saleswomen, Karen and Tiffany, stepped outside. They exchanged glances, their eyes narrowing when they noticed Chloe still lingering nearby. "Hey, didn't you hear what Mike told you?" Karen called out, her voice dripping with condescension as she approached. "We don't need any loiterers here." Chloe looked up, blinking in confusion. She hadn't done anything wrong. She was just sitting on a public bench. "I'm not bothering anyone," she replied quietly, trying to keep her voice steady, but her hands were trembling again. Tiffany, the other saleswoman, crossed her arms and gave Chloe a scornful once-over. "Sweetie, this isn't the kind of place for you," she said with a fake smile. "Go hang out at the mall or something. This is a luxury store." Chloe's eyes widened. She wanted to say something, anything, to defend herself, but the words got stuck in her throat. She could feel her face flushing again, the embarrassment returning full force. It was like they were talking to her as if she was less than a person, just because of how she looked. Karen and Tiffany exchanged a knowing smirk, clearly pleased with themselves for driving her away. "Look," Karen added, leaning in as if sharing a secret, "we wouldn't want you to embarrass yourself trying to look at things you could never afford. Trust us. It's for your own good." That was the last straw. Chloe stood up abruptly, clenching her fists at her sides. "You don't even know me," she shouted, her voice cracking with the force of her pent-up frustration. "You don't know what I can afford." The sudden outburst took the two women by surprise, but their shock quickly turned into amusement. Karen chuckled while Tiffany shook her head, as if Chloe had just told the most ridiculous joke. All right, Karen said with a shrug. "If you really want to make a scene, go ahead. But don't say we didn't warn you when someone calls the cops." Chloe's shoulders slumped. She had no fight left in her. It was clear that nothing she said would change their minds. They had already decided who she was based on nothing more than her skin color and the way she was dressed. Defeated, she turned and walked away, the sound of the saleswomen's mocking laughter echoing behind her. Feeling utterly humiliated, Chloe walked a few blocks down the street and found herself in front of an old bookstore. The shop had a cozy, welcoming vibe, and the scent of old paper and ink wafted out every time someone opened the door. Without thinking, she slipped inside, letting the familiar smell calm her frayed nerves. Inside, The store was quiet and peaceful. Shelves filled with books of all shapes and sizes lined the walls, and the soft glow of warm lights made the place feel like a hidden sanctuary. Chloe wandered through the aisles, letting her fingers glide over the spines of books, trying to forget the harsh words that still rang in her ears. As she lost herself in the rows of stories and adventures, Chloe's mind began to clear. She reminded herself of what her dad always said. Don't let other people's ignorance change who you are. It was easier said than done, though. She couldn't help but feel small, like she would never be enough in their eyes, no matter what she did. After a while, she found a quiet corner near the back of the store and sat down with a book she had picked at random. She wasn't really reading it. The words blurred together as her mind kept replaying the scene at the boutique. Why did they treat her that way? Why did they look at her like she didn't belong? Lost in her thoughts, Chloe didn't notice the time passing. It wasn't until she heard the faint chime of the store's doorbell that she looked up. Peering through the rows of books, she saw a tall man in a well-tailored suit walk in. He looked out of place in the cozy bookstore, like he belonged in one of those fancy offices downtown. But then, Chloe's heart skipped a beat. It was her father, Jonathan Parker. Chloe quickly closed the book and got up, feeling both relieved and nervous at the same time. She hadn't expected him to find her here. "Chloe?" Jonathan called out as he looked around the store, his eyes scanning the shelves. "Are you in here?" "Dad," she replied, rushing toward him. The moment he saw her, his stern expression softened. He knelt down to her level and pulled her into a tight hug. "I've been looking everywhere for you," he said, his voice gentle but worried. "What happened? You just disappeared." Chloe hesitated, not sure if she should tell him everything. But when she looked into her father's eyes, she knew she couldn't hide it. I tried to go into that store, Madison's boutique," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "But they wouldn't let me in. They said I didn't belong there." Jonathan's face darkened, his jaw tightening. "They said what?" he asked, his voice low and controlled. But Chloe could sense the anger simmering just beneath the surface. She nodded, tears welling up again as she recounted the encounter. "They were so mean, Dad. They acted like I was nothing." Jonathan stood up, his expression now set with a look Chloe recognized. It was the same look he had when he was about to go into a big meeting or deal with a difficult client. "All right," he said, taking her hand. "Let's go back there." Chloe's eyes widened. "What?" "No, Dad, it's okay. I don't want to cause more trouble." But Jonathan just gave her a reassuring squeeze. "You did nothing wrong, Chloe." "They did. And I'm not going to let them get away with treating you like that." With that, he turned and led her out of the bookstore, back toward the boutique. Chloe's heart raced with a mix of anxiety and hope. She wasn't sure what her dad was planning, but for the first time that day, she felt like maybe, just maybe, things would be okay. As Chloe and Jonathan approached Madison's boutique, she could feel her stomach twisting into knots. The memory of the way Karen and Tiffany had spoken to her was still fresh in her mind. She was nervous about going back, but at the same time, a small part of her was curious to see how things would unfold now that her father was with her. Jonathan walked with purpose, his hand firmly but gently holding Chloe's. His stride was confident, unbothered by the glances they received from passers-by who were drawn to his commanding presence. Chloe found herself standing a little taller, feeling braver just being beside him. When they reached the entrance of the boutique, the automatic doors slid open with a quiet whoosh. "Mike!" The security guard, was still stationed by the door, his expression immediately hardening when he saw Chloe. He stepped forward to block their path, his eyes narrowing suspiciously at Jonathan. "Can I help you?" Mike asked, his tone dripping with the same condescension Chloe had faced earlier. "Yes, you can," Jonathan replied, his voice steady and calm, though there was an edge to it. "My daughter was here earlier, and she was refused entry. I would like to speak to whoever is in charge." Mike glanced at Chloe, his lips curling into a smirk. "Your daughter, huh?" He clearly didn't believe Jonathan. "Look, sir, we have certain standards here. Maybe try a different store down the street." Jonathan's expression remained calm, but Chloe could see the way his jaw clenched. "I'm not asking," he said, his voice lowering to a tone that made even Mike hesitate. "Now move aside." Mike looked like he was going to argue, but something in Jonathan's eyes made him think twice. Reluctantly, he stepped aside, allowing them to enter. Chloe kept her head down as they walked in, the familiar scent of expensive perfume hitting her like a wave of unwelcome memories. The boutique was just as Chloe remembered it, sleek, pristine, and filled with clothing that probably cost more than a month's rent. Karen and Tiffany were at the front desk, chatting and laughing, clearly enjoying a break from their duties. When they saw Jonathan and Chloe, their laughter stopped abruptly. "Oh, it's you again," Karen said, her eyes narrowing as she recognized Chloe. But when she looked at Jonathan, her expression shifted. His tailored suit and confident demeanor were unmistakable signs that he was someone of importance. "Good afternoon," Jonathan began, his voice polite but with an unmistakable firmness. "I'm Jonathan Parker, and this is my daughter, Chloe. Earlier today, she was refused entry and insulted by your staff. I'd like an explanation." Karen's eyes widened slightly, and she glanced at Tiffany, who was suddenly looking very interested in a stack of brochures on the counter. Sir," Karen stammered. Trying to regain her composure, "I'm sure there's been some kind of misunderstanding. We were simply following store policy." Jonathan's smile was thin, and Chloe could tell he wasn't buying a word of it. "Really? And what policy, exactly, would justify turning away a 12-year-old girl who just wanted to look around?" His tone was razor-sharp, cutting through Karen's flimsy excuse. Tiffany, realizing that this wasn't going to blow over easily, tried to jump in. "It's not like that, sir," she said quickly. "We just have to be careful, with certain types of people." Jonathan's eyes flashed, and Chloe instinctively squeezed his hand, knowing that was a wrong thing to say. "Certain types of people," he repeated slowly, his voice dangerously calm. "Would you care to elaborate on what you mean by that?" Tiffany's face turned beet red, and she stammered something incoherent. Karen, meanwhile, was desperately trying to think of a way to salvage the situation. "Sir, I assure you, we meant no disrespect. We just have to make sure that our customers fit a certain profile." Jonathan finished for her, his voice now cold. "I see. Well, let me make this very clear. This profile you're referring to just insulted my daughter, who has every right to shop here like anyone else." By now, a few other customers in the store had noticed the confrontation and were watching with curious interest. Karen, realizing they were drawing attention, tried to smile. "Perhaps we can handle this privately," she suggested, her voice wavering. "Actually," Jonathan said, his voice rising just enough to ensure everyone in the store could hear him, "I think it's important that everyone here knows how you treat people who don't fit your idea of what a customer should look like." Karen's smile faltered completely, and she shot Tiffany a desperate look. But there was no getting out of this one. Jonathan was like a force of nature, and Chloe had never seen him so intense. It was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. At that moment, the sound of footsteps echoed from the back of the store, and a middle-aged man in an impeccable suit emerged. He looked around, taking in the tense scene, before his eyes landed on Jonathan. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice calm but authoritative. "Yes, there is," Jonathan said, turning to face the newcomer. "I believe you're the manager?" The man nodded. "I'm Thomas Baker, the store manager. How can I help you?" Jonathan took a deep breath, steadying himself before speaking. "I came here to address the fact that your staff discriminated against my daughter simply because she didn't look like your usual clientele." Thomas's expression shifted as he listened, and he shot a sharp look at Karen and Tiffany. "Is this true?" he asked them, his tone leaving no room for excuses. Both women began to stammer, trying to explain themselves, but Thomas held up a hand to silence them. "Enough," he said. "We have a zero-tolerance policy for this kind of behavior." Turning back to Jonathan, he added, "I sincerely apologize for what happened. Rest assured, we will address this immediately." Chloe watched as Karen and Tiffany's faces went pale. They looked like they were about to protest, but Thomas was already turning to them with a look that said their fate was sealed. "Please follow me to my office," he said to the two women, who now looked like they were walking to their own execution. "I believe we need to have a serious conversation about your employment here." As they disappeared into the back, Thomas turned to Jonathan and Chloe with a sincere expression. "Mr. Parker, Miss Chloe, please allow me to personally extend our deepest apologies. If there's anything we can do to make this right." Jonathan nodded curtly, but Chloe could see he was still seething. "We'll see about that," he said, his voice clipped. "But for now, I think my daughter and I will take our business elsewhere." With that, he took Chloe's hand, and they walked out of the boutique, leaving behind a stunned silence. The ride home from Madison's boutique was quiet. Chloe sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window as the city whizzed past. She could still hear the biting words of Karen and Tiffany in her head, their sneers and dismissive glances echoing like a bad dream she couldn't shake off. Beside her, Jonathan drove in silence, his fingers gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly. Chloe was grateful for the silence, but at the same time, she felt the tension building between them. She knew her dad was angry for her, angry at what had happened, but it was more than that. She could see it in the way his jaw clenched every time they hit a red light, in the way he kept glancing at her like he wanted to say something but didn't know how. Finally, as they pulled into the driveway of their home, Jonathan turned off the engine and let out a long breath. "Chloe," he said softly, breaking the silence that had hung over them like a dark cloud. "I'm sorry you had to go through that." Chloe nodded but didn't meet his eyes. "It's not your fault, Dad," she mumbled. But deep down, she couldn't help but wonder if it was somehow her fault, if maybe she really didn't belong in a place like that. Jonathan reached over and gently lifted her chin, forcing her to look at him. "Listen to me, Chloe. What happened back there, those women, that security guard, it had nothing to do with you and everything to do with them. Do you understand?" She nodded again, but Jonathan could see the doubt in her eyes. He let out a sigh and leaned back in his seat, running a hand through his hair. "I know it's hard to understand right now," he said quietly, "but the way people treat you says more about them than it does about you." Chloe stayed silent, letting his words sink in. She knew he was right. She'd heard similar things before from her teachers, her friends' parents, even her own mother before she passed away. But it was one thing to hear those words and another to really believe them, especially after what she'd just experienced. As they got out of the car and walked into the house, Chloe felt the familiar comfort of their home wrapped around her like a warm blanket. This was her safe place, where she didn't have to worry about being judged by the color of her skin or the clothes she wore. But today, even that comfort felt a little bit hollow. "Why don't you go get changed, sweetheart?" Jonathan suggested, his voice gentle. "I'll order us some dinner. How about pizza. Chloe managed a small smile. Yeah, pizza sounds good, she said before heading up to her room. She changed into her favorite pajamas, the ones covered in tiny stars, and flopped onto her bed, staring up at the ceiling. She couldn't stop replaying the scene at the boutique over and over in her mind. The way the women had looked at her, like she was something they needed to get rid of as quickly as possible. She felt a hot tear slide down her cheek and angrily wiped it away. She didn't want to cry. She didn't want to feel this way. A soft knock on her door pulled her out of her thoughts. "Come in," she called, her voice cracking a little. Jonathan stepped inside, holding 2 steaming slices of pizza on a plate. "I thought you might want to eat up here," he said, handing her the plate. Chloe took it gratefully, her stomach growling at the sight of the cheesy goodness. But as she took a bite, she realized she wasn't as hungry as she thought. Jonathan sat on the edge of her bed, watching her carefully. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked after a moment. Chloe shrugged. "What's there to talk about? They were just mean," she said, her voice small. "They were more than mean, Chloe," Jonathan said, his voice firm but gentle. "They were wrong, and you have every right to feel upset about it." Chloe put down her plate and hugged her knees to her chest. "But why?" she whispered, looking up at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. "Why do people treat me like that just because I'm different?" Jonathan's heart broke a little at the sight of his daughter's pain. He wished he could shield her from all the ugliness in the world, but he knew that wasn't possible. "Some people are afraid of what they don't understand," he said softly. "And instead of trying to understand, they lash out. It's not fair, and it's not right, but it's the truth." Chloe wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "But you're rich," she said, her voice tinged with confusion. "We have everything. Why does it still matter?" Jonathan sighed deeply. "Because to some people, it doesn't matter how much money you have or how successful you are. All they see is the color of your skin." He reached over and squeezed her hand. "But that doesn't mean you have to accept it. You have a voice, Chloe, and you can use it to stand up for yourself." Chloe nodded slowly, her father's words starting to lift a heavy weight in her chest. "I don't want to feel scared to go into places anymore," she said quietly. "You don't have to be scared," Jonathan assured her. "And you're not alone in this. I'll always be here to back you up." He smiled softly, and for the first time since the incident, Chloe felt a tiny flicker of hope. "Thanks, Dad," she whispered, leaning into him for a hug. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. In that moment, all the tension and fear from the day seemed to melt away. After a few moments, Jonathan pulled back and gave her a playful nudge. "Now, come on," he said, trying to lighten the mood. "That pizza's getting cold. Let's finish it before it turns into cardboard." Chloe giggled softly and nodded. As they ate together, sitting cross-legged on her bed, she felt a little more like herself again. The world outside might be unfair, but here, in the safety of her father's arms, she knew she was loved. And for now, that was enough. The next morning, the events of the previous day still lingered heavily in Chloe's mind, like a storm cloud that wouldn't drift away. She was seated at the breakfast table, pushing her scrambled eggs around her plate, her usual appetite nowhere to be found. Jonathan, sitting across from her with his coffee, could tell that his daughter was still deeply troubled. "Chloe," he said gently, setting his cup down, "I know yesterday was hard, but I want you to know I'm not just going to let it slide." Chloe looked up at him, her eyes widening slightly. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice cautious. "I mean that those people need to be held accountable for what they did," Jonathan said firmly. "They can't just treat people like that. and get away with it. I spoke to my lawyer this morning. Chloe blinked, surprised. Your lawyer? She repeated, her fork frozen in midair. Jonathan nodded. Yes. I've already drafted a complaint against Madison's boutique. What they did to you is discrimination, plain and simple. And I'm not going to stand for it. For a moment, Chloe felt a flicker of something she couldn't quite identify. Pride, maybe? Relief? But it was quickly replaced by doubt. But, Dad, she said slowly, do you really think it will change anything? I mean, they'll just say it was a misunderstanding or something. Jonathan's expression softened, and he reached across the table to take her hand. I know it feels like a small drop in a very large ocean, Chloe. But if we don't stand up for ourselves, then who will? Sometimes, making noise is the only way people will listen. Chloe stared down at her plate, absorbing his words. She'd always admired her father's determination and sense of justice, but she'd never seen him so personally affected by something like this. It made her realize that this fight wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been treated like she was dismissed and devalued because of something as superficial as skin color. I guess you're right, she said quietly, looking up to meet his gaze. But it's still scary. Jonathan squeezed her hand. It is scary, he agreed, but you don't have to face it alone. We're in this together. For the first time that morning, Chloe smiled, a small but genuine curve of her lips. Okay, she said softly. I trust you, Dad. Jonathan gave her a reassuring nod. Good. Now, how about we finish breakfast and do something fun today? We've been cooped up in the house for too long. What did you have in mind? Chloe asked, her curiosity piqued. Well, I was thinking maybe a trip to the park. We could grab ice cream on the way, Jonathan suggested, trying to lighten the mood. Chloe's eyes lit up at the mention of ice cream. Okay, that sounds nice, she said, her spirits lifting. The idea of spending the day with her dad, away from the chaos of yesterday, was exactly what she needed. The park was bustling with life by the time they arrived, the sounds of laughter and the smell of freshly cut grass filling the air. Chloe and Jonathan walked side by side, with Chloe slowly starting to feel like the weight on her chest was easing. The sun was shining, and for a little while, everything felt normal again. They found a quiet spot under a large oak tree where they could watch the ducks glide across the pond. Jonathan handed Chloe a cone of her favorite mint chocolate chip ice cream, and she took a big, satisfying lick. You know, Jonathan began after a few minutes of comfortable silence, I'm really proud of you, Chloe. Chloe looked up at him, her brow furrowing in confusion. Proud of me? For what? She asked, genuinely puzzled. For being strong, he replied. For not letting those awful people break you. It would have been easy to just let them get to you, but you didn't. You're stronger than you think. Chloe shrugged, looking down at her half-eaten cone. I don't feel strong, she admitted. I feel small and angry, and I don't know what to do with it. That's okay, Jonathan said gently. You're allowed to feel all of those things. But what matters is what you do next. You can let the anger eat you up, or you can use it to make a difference. Chloe thought about that as she watched a group of kids playing nearby. I just don't want to feel like this forever, she whispered. You won't, Jonathan assured her. And the fact that you're even thinking about it, about wanting to change things, that's a sign that you're already on the right path. They sat there for a while longer, just enjoying the peace of the park. Eventually, Chloe started to feel a little lighter, like the dark cloud that had been following her since yesterday was finally beginning to dissipate. Later that evening, back at home, Jonathan received a call from his lawyer. Chloe watched from the doorway as her father spoke in hushed tones, his expression serious but calm. When he hung up, he turned to her with a small smile. "The complaint has been filed," he said simply. "We'll see where it goes from here." Chloe nodded slowly, feeling a mix of emotions. She wasn't entirely sure what filing a complaint would accomplish, but the fact that her dad was willing to fight for her made her feel something she hadn't felt in a long time. "Hope." "Thanks, Dad," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For everything." Jonathan walked over and pulled her into a hug. "I'm always going to fight for you, Chloe," he murmured into her hair. "No matter what." As they stood there, wrapped in each other's embrace, Chloe realized that maybe she didn't have to have all the answers right now. Maybe it was enough to know that she had people who loved her and who would stand by her no matter what. And for now, that was enough. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the household slowly started to change. Filing the complaint against Madison's boutique had stirred up more attention than Jonathan initially anticipated. The news of the incident had started to circulate in local media outlets, and soon enough, people were talking about it all over town. Jonathan's phone rang constantly with reporters trying to get statements, but he remained focused on what mattered most: supporting Chloe. At first, Chloe felt nervous about the sudden spotlight on her family. The incident at the boutique was something she'd rather forget, not relive in front of the whole city. But as she watched her father handle each interview with poise, talking about the importance of equality and standing up against discrimination, she couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. One evening, after another long day of interviews, Jonathan found Chloe sitting at the dining table, scrolling through social media on her phone. She had been following the reactions online. Some people were supportive, while others were dismissive, claiming they were making a big deal out of nothing. "Hey, kiddo," Jonathan said as he walked in, looking a bit tired but satisfied. "What's got you so engrossed?" Chloe hesitated before showing him her phone. "It's just, people are talking about what happened. Some are saying that you're doing the right thing, but others, they're calling you names. They say you're just looking for attention." Jonathan took the phone from her, scanning the comments. "You know, Chloe," he said after a moment, "there are always going to be people who don't want to see change. It scares them, but that doesn't mean we stop doing what's right." Chloe nodded slowly, absorbing his words. "I just don't understand why people have to be so mean," she muttered. "It's easier for some people to tear others down than to confront their own issues," Jonathan explained gently. "But here's the thing. We're not doing this for them. We're doing it so that one day, kids like you can walk into any store anywhere and be treated with the respect they deserve." Chloe smiled faintly at that. She knew her father was right, but the whole situation still felt overwhelming. "I wish I could do something," she admitted quietly. Jonathan's eyes sparkled with an idea. "Actually, there is something you could do, if you're interested," he said. "Why don't you share your story, in your own words?" "What do you mean?" Chloe asked, her brow furrowing in confusion. "I mean writing it down," Jonathan said, leaning forward. "You've always been good with words, and people need to hear from you. It's one thing for them to listen to me, but it's something entirely different when it comes from you. You have a voice, Chloe, and it's powerful." Chloe thought about it for a moment, her mind racing. She had always loved writing. It was one of the few things that made her feel truly free. But the idea of putting her story out there for everyone to see was terrifying. Still, she couldn't deny there was a part of her that liked the idea of taking control of the narrative. "Okay," she said finally, her voice steady. "I'll give it a try." Jonathan beamed at her, pride evident in his eyes. "That's my girl," he said, giving her a gentle squeeze on the shoulder. The next day, Chloe sat at her desk with her laptop open, staring at the blank document in front of her. She took a deep breath, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She didn't want to just recount the events. She wanted people to understand how it had made her feel, the fear, the shame, and the anger that had bubbled up inside her. But she also wanted to share the hope she was beginning to feel, the strength she was discovering within herself. Slowly, she began to type. My name is Chloe Williams, and I am 12 years old. Last week, I went to a store called Madison's Boutique with the simple intention of browsing the clothes. But instead of being treated like a customer, I was treated like a criminal. I was told that I didn't belong, simply because of the color of my skin. The words flowed more easily than she expected. She wrote about the humiliation she felt, the look in the eyes of the sales staff, and the way the security guard's hands had gripped her arm. But she also wrote about how her father had stood by her side, refusing to let her be silenced. When she was finished, she read over what she had written, her heart racing. It was raw and honest, and it scared her to think about sharing it. But when she showed it to Jonathan, he smiled and told her it was perfect. With a deep breath, Chloe hit post and watched as her story went live on social media. Within minutes, comments and messages started pouring in. Some were filled with support and encouragement, while others were less kind. But as Chloe read through them, she realized that she didn't care as much about the negative comments. For every hateful remark, there were 2 more people who were inspired by her courage. I'm so proud of you, Chloe, Jonathan said as they sat together, watching her post go viral. You've done something really brave. Chloe smiled, feeling a warmth in her chest that she hadn't felt in a long time. Thanks, Dad, she said softly. I think I needed to do this. For me. Jonathan nodded, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. And you know what? I think you just made a bigger difference than you realize. As they sat there, scrolling through the responses, Chloe couldn't help but feel that maybe, just maybe, things were going to be okay. For the first time since the incident, she felt like she had taken back a piece of her power, and that, she decided, was worth all the fear and doubt she had faced. The following week was a whirlwind for Chloe. She never expected her story to gain so much attention, but it seemed like everywhere she turned, someone was talking about it. The post she had shared online had been picked up by several local news outlets and even some national platforms. People were reposting, commenting, and sharing their own experiences with discrimination. It was as if Chloe's story had unlocked a floodgate of voices that had been waiting to be heard. At first, it was overwhelming. Chloe wasn't used to all the attention, and the sudden influx of notifications on her phone made her anxious. But as she read through the messages, she noticed a common thread. People were thanking her for speaking up, for having the courage to say what so many others had felt but couldn't put into words. Some shared stories of their own children facing similar treatment, while others simply sent messages of support and solidarity. Sitting in her room one afternoon, Chloe scrolled through the hundreds of comments, her heart swelling with a mixture of emotions. She was just a kid. She never thought she could make such a big impact. But as she read through each story, she realized that her voice had become part of something much larger than herself. Chloe, you have a visitor, Jonathan called from downstairs. Confused, Chloe put down her phone and headed to the living room. When she got there, she was surprised to see a woman with a kind smile and a camera crew standing behind her. Hello, Chloe, the woman said warmly. My name is Maria Thompson. I'm a journalist with Channel 9 News, and I've been following your story. I was wondering if you'd be open to doing an interview. Chloe hesitated, glancing over at her father, who gave her a reassuring nod. I guess so, she said nervously. The journalist smiled. Don't worry. We just want to hear your side of the story. You've already inspired so many people by sharing your experience online. I think it's important for people to see the person behind the story. Jonathan sat beside Chloe on the couch as the crew set up their equipment. The interview began with simple questions. How she felt that day at the boutique, what was going through her mind when the security guard had stopped her. But as the questions delved deeper, Chloe found herself opening up more than she expected. She talked about how it felt to be judged for something as trivial as the color of her skin, and how her father's unwavering support had helped her through the darkest moments. By the time the interview was over, Chloe felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She hadn't realized how much she needed to say those words out loud. As the journalist thanked her and packed up to leave, Jonathan put an arm around her. "You did amazing, Chloe," he said, his voice full of pride. "You have no idea how many people you've helped today." But the impact of Chloe's story didn't stop there. The interview aired that evening, and the response was even more powerful than before. Jonathan's inbox was flooded with emails from community leaders, teachers, and even a few politicians who wanted to support Chloe's cause. There were offers for speaking engagements, donations to anti-racism organizations, and even a proposal to host a town hall meeting to discuss ways to combat discrimination in their community. Jonathan was stunned. He had always believed in doing the right thing, but he never imagined that standing up for Chloe would ignite such a movement. "Looks like you've started something big, kiddo," he said, ruffling Chloe's hair playfully. But for Chloe, the most meaningful messages came from other kids her age. She received handwritten letters and drawings from children who had seen her story on TV. One letter, in particular, stood out to her. It was from a girl named Jasmine who wrote, "Dear Chloe, my mom and I watched your interview. I've been treated badly because of my skin too, but I was always too scared to say anything. When I saw you on TV, I felt like maybe I could be brave too. Thank you for standing up. You're my hero." Chloe's eyes filled with tears as she read the letter. For so long, she had felt small and powerless. But now, she realized that she had made a difference in someone's life. She had shown other kids that it was okay to stand up for themselves, to speak out against injustice. Later that week, a special community event was held in the town square. Local businesses, churches, and schools came together to show their support for Chloe and to promote inclusivity. Jonathan was asked to speak, and Chloe was given the chance to say a few words as well. Standing on the stage, Chloe felt her nerves bubble up, but as she looked out at the crowd, she saw familiar faces, her classmates, teachers, and even some of the people who had been there at the boutique that day. She took a deep breath and began to speak. "I never thought that sharing my story would lead to all of this," she began, her voice steady. "But I'm so grateful that it did. No one should have to feel like they don't belong because of how they look. I hope that by speaking out, we can all work together to make this world a kinder place." The crowd erupted in applause, and for the first time, Chloe felt like she had found her voice. As she stepped down from the stage, Jonathan enveloped her in a tight hug. "You were incredible," he whispered. "You've done more than I ever could have imagined." As they walked home that evening, hand in hand, Chloe felt lighter than she had in weeks. The road ahead was still uncertain, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't alone. She had a community behind her, and together, they were going to make a difference. And for the first time, Chloe didn't just feel like a kid trying to fit in. She felt like a leader, a force for change. And that, she realized, was just the beginning. Months passed since Chloe's story first went viral, and as the days turned into weeks, She began to see tangible change in her community. The protests, the online petitions, and the voices that had rallied behind her were not just passing fads. They were the beginning of a movement, one that would shift the cultural landscape in subtle but powerful ways. Jonathan, who had been by her side every step of the way, could see the change in Chloe too. She had become more confident, more outspoken, and the fear that once held her back seemed to evaporate. It was as if her voice had grown stronger with every word she spoke, every letter she read, and every story she heard. One afternoon, as they sat together in their living room, Chloe looked up from her phone with a smile. "Dad, you'll never guess what happened today." Jonathan raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What's up?" "A local school invited me to speak at their assembly next month," she said, her voice filled with excitement. "They want me to talk about my experience and how it's important for kids to stand up for what's right." Jonathan's eyes widened in surprise, then softened with pride. "That's amazing, Chloe. You're really making a difference." Chloe's heart swelled. She had never imagined that her story would lead her to this moment, speaking to a room full of kids who were just like her. It felt surreal, but she also knew it was right. She had found her purpose, her voice, and now she was determined to use it for good. The media attention had died down, but the changes that had started in their small town were still going strong. The boutique where Chloe had been rejected had undergone a massive shift. After the incident, the owner, Chloe's adoptive father, had been more committed than ever to creating an inclusive and welcoming environment. He held diversity training for all of his employees and implemented a strict policy against discrimination. Some of the staff who had been involved in the incident were fired, but others had returned, determined to make things right. It wasn't just a boutique, either. Several local businesses had followed suit, launching similar initiatives to address systemic racism and create more inclusive spaces. The town had held meetings to discuss how they could work together to combat prejudice and foster acceptance, and local leaders had pledged to continue the fight. But even more significant was the change in the people who lived there. Chloe's bravery had sparked something in them. They realized that they had a responsibility to speak out against injustice, to stand up when they saw something wrong, and to support those who were marginalized. It was no longer just about a single act of racism. It was about changing the way they saw each other, the way they interacted, and the way they lived together. Chloe stood at the front of the assembly hall a few weeks later, facing a crowd of eager faces. The room was filled with kids of all ages, and she could feel their eyes on her, waiting for her to speak. She felt a flutter in her stomach, but it wasn't fear this time. It was excitement. "Hi, everyone," she began, her voice steady. "I'm Chloe, and I'm here to talk to you about something really important. Something that I think a lot of us might be too scared to talk about, but we should. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard." She paused, scanning the room. The kids were listening intently, their faces open and curious. Chloe took a deep breath and continued. "When I was rejected from that boutique, I didn't know what to do. I felt small, like I didn't matter. But I realized that no matter what anyone says, I do matter. And so do you. Every one of us matters, no matter what we look like or where we come from." The room was silent, and Chloe could feel her words sinking in. She was no longer just talking about herself. She was talking about all of them, about everyone who had ever felt less than, who had been treated unfairly, or had been made to feel invisible. "We all deserve to be treated with respect," Chloe said, her voice growing stronger. "And if you see someone being treated badly because of the color of their skin, or where they're from, or how they look, you have to speak up, because we are better than that. We can do better. The crowd erupted into applause, and Chloe felt tears welling in her eyes. It wasn't just the cheers that moved her. It was the fact that she had spoken the truth, and they had listened. They had heard her. Jonathan stood in the back of the room, watching with pride as his daughter spoke to the future. He knew this moment was the culmination of everything they had been through together. And he knew deep down that Chloe's bravery had planted a seed of change that would continue to grow. As Chloe finished her speech, she stepped down from the stage, her heart full. The students crowded around her, asking questions, shaking her hand, and thanking her for being their voice. She felt the weight of her journey, but also the hope of what was to come. She wasn't just an individual anymore. She was part of something bigger, a movement that had started with a single act of courage and had spread to countless others. That evening, as Chloe and Jonathan walked home together, Chloe felt a quiet satisfaction in her heart. She had faced the darkness and had come out stronger, and now she was shining a light for others to follow. "You were amazing today, Chloe," Jonathan said, his voice full of love and admiration. "You've created something beautiful." Chloe smiled, looking up at her dad. "We've created something beautiful." And with that, Chloe knew that her fight was far from over. But it wasn't just her fight anymore. It was everyone's fight. Together, they would continue to push for change, one small step at a time.